I was already reaching for my coat when my uncle grabbed my arm and said, "Don't make this worse." I almost laughed. I was making it worse. My father had just told me, in front of 47 people seated at round tables with white linen and little sprigs of baby's breath in glass vases, that I had not been invited to my brother's rehearsal dinner, that my presence was an embarrassment, that I should have known better than to show up like this. His exact words were, "This isn't the place for you, Nora. Except my name isn't Nora." That's what he called my cousin, his favorite, the one who'd gone to Vanderbilt and married a cardiologist and sent Christmas cards every year with a professionally photographed family on a dock somewhere. My name is Sloane. I'm his daughter, and I'd driven 6 hours from Pittsburgh to be there. My uncle's hand on my arm was meant to be calming. It wasn't. It was the hand of someone who'd watched my father run his household like a courtroom for 30 years and had learned that the least painful thing to do was stay out of it. I didn't blame him. I'd learned the same thing for a long time. I set my coat back down. Not loudly. I didn't raise my voice. I'd learned a long time ago that raising your voice around my father only gave him more material. He looked at me the way he always did. Like I was a problem he'd been handed that he hadn't asked for, a case he didn't want to try. My father is a retired circuit court judge. He spent 32 years deciding who was right and who was wrong, and somewhere along the way he brought that home with him and never quite left the bench. In our house he presided. My mother softened his rulings when she could. My brother Colt learned to perform well enough that verdicts rarely went against him. And I became the dissenting opinion, the one he couldn't account for, the one who didn't fit the docket. I was the kid who wanted to study chemistry when he wanted me to study law, who took a research position in Philadelphia after college instead of coming home, who didn't call enough, didn't visit enough, didn't explain myself enough, not because I didn't love my family, but because every explanation I gave felt like entering a courtroom I hadn't agreed to appear in. The last real conversation my father and I had was 2 years ago at Christmas. I told him I'd been accepted into a fellowship program at the National Institutes of Health. He asked if I was going to actually commit to something this time or if this was like the other things. I left the next morning. I told my mother I had to get back to work, which wasn't entirely untrue. I hadn't been home since, so when my brother called in February to tell me he was getting married in April, and that the rehearsal dinner was the Thursday before the wedding, and that he really wanted me there. "Sloane, please." I believed him. I believed Colt. That's on me. I should have asked more questions. I should have called my mother separately and confirmed, but Colt said he wanted me there, and I'd spent 2 years missing my family in the particular way you miss people you've chosen distance from, which is a complicated and guilty kind of missing, and I said yes. I drove from Pittsburgh on a Thursday afternoon, stopped once for gas and a terrible cup of coffee somewhere in West Virginia, and arrived at the restaurant, a nice Italian place in my parents' suburb of Nashville, at 6:40, just as the other guests were being seated. My mother saw me first. The look on her face was not happiness. It was a look I recognized, anticipation of something she could not stop. My father saw me second. He came over before I'd even reached the table. He was wearing a charcoal suit, the one he wore to things he considered important. He looked the same as always, tall, composed, the kind of man who takes up space in a room without seeming to try. He used to make me proud, that quality. When I was little, I thought my father was the most important person in any room he entered. I spent a lot of years trying to matter to him the way a room full of strangers did. "Who told you about this?" he said. "Not hello, not you look well, not it's been a long time." "Colt invited me," I said. Something crossed his face. He glanced back toward the table where my brother was talking to his fiancée's family and had not yet noticed me. Then he looked back at me, and his voice dropped just slightly, which meant he was about to say something he'd already decided. "This dinner is for family and close friends," he said. "People who've been present, people who are part of Colt's life." I waited. I knew he wasn't done. "You haven't been present, Sloane. You've made that clear. I don't think it's appropriate for you to be here." The table nearest to us had gone quiet. A woman I didn't know, one of the fiancé's aunts, I think, was looking at her water glass with tremendous concentration. My uncle, my father's brother, who had been standing a few feet away and overheard all of it, was the one who came over and put his hand on my arm, and I was the one reaching for my coat. I don't know exactly what I felt in that moment. I've tried to reconstruct it since. There was something humiliating about it, but the humiliation sat underneath something else, something quieter and older. It was the feeling of being 9 years old and bringing home a science fair project and having him ask if I'd gotten help. It was the feeling of being 16 and telling him I wanted to be a chemist and watching him look at my mother like she might want to intercede. It was every time I'd translated his disappointment in myself into something I'd done wrong and tried to do differently, until I finally stopped translating and just left. I set my coat down. My uncle said, "Sloane," and that's when Colt's fiancé walked over. His name is Brett. I'd met him once before, briefly, at Thanksgiving 2 years ago, before everything went sideways. He's a quiet, steady kind of person, the kind of man who notices things. He'd clearly noticed this. He came to stand between my father and me, not aggressively, just there, present. He was still holding a glass of sparkling water, and he set it on the nearest table before he spoke. He looked at my father first. Then he looked at me. "You're Sloane," he said. "Colt's talked about you." "I know," my father started. "Brett, this is," I heard, Brett said, gently, clearly. "Mr. Harmon, I have a lot of respect for you, but Colt asked his sister to be here tonight. That was his call to make." My father straightened slightly. He was accustomed to being the one who ended conversations. "There's context you may not be aware of," my father said. "Maybe," Brett said, "but she drove 6 hours, and she's going to sit down." Then he looked at me, and there was something in it that I didn't expect. Not pity, something more like recognition. The look of someone who understood, without needing the whole history, that a thing was wrong. "Come on," he said. "I'll introduce you to my family." I sat through that dinner in a state of strange suspension. My father was cordial for the rest of the evening. That's the thing about him. He knows how to be cordial. He spent decades being cordial to defense attorneys he thought were dishonest, to plaintiffs he found unconvincing, to everyone who stood in his courtroom. Cordiality was something he could deploy. Warmth was something else. My mother found me near the breadbasket during a lull and held my hand and didn't say anything, which was its own kind of language. We've had a lot of conversations that way, my mother and I. She loves my father and she loves me, and she has spent a very long time standing in the space between those two facts. "I didn't know he was going to do that," she said. "I know," I said. "Colt wanted you here." "I know that too." She squeezed my hand and let go, and then my aunt was calling her name from across the room. Colt found me later, when people were leaving. He looked genuinely distressed in the way that Colt only ever looks distressed when he's caught between two things he can't fix. He's 4 years older than me, and we've always had the kind of sibling relationship that runs on intermittent signals. Long stretches of ordinary distance, and then these sudden moments of closeness that feel like remembering something you thought you'd forgotten. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know he was going to." "Don't," I said. "It's your rehearsal dinner. Don't spend it apologizing for him. You're staying for the wedding. I wasn't planning on leaving." He laughed a little and I laughed a little, and for just a minute it was like we were kids again in the back of my father's car, finding ways to be on each other's side without saying so directly. I drove to the hotel. I sat on the bed in my room and stared at the ceiling for a while. I ordered room service, a bowl of pasta and a glass of wine, and I ate it in my work clothes because I hadn't had the energy to change. I thought about calling my friend Petra, who would have been satisfyingly furious on my behalf. I thought about turning around and driving back to Pittsburgh. I didn't call anyone. I went to sleep. The wedding was on a Saturday, at a small chapel about 20 minutes from my parents' house. Stone exterior, old oak trees around the parking lot, the kind of place that photographs beautifully. Colt had good taste. Or his fiancée, Addie, did. She was a landscape architect, and she had an eye for things like that. I wore a blue dress that I'd bought specifically for this trip and hadn't been sure about. It turned out fine. I arrived early enough to get a seat near the middle, not too far back. not close to seem like I was making a statement. My father came in with my mother on his arm. He saw me and nodded, that was all. A nod, the way you'd acknowledge someone you know professionally. I nodded back. The ceremony was lovely. Colt cried a little during his vows, which surprised everyone who knew him, and Addie laughed when he did, which was the right response. Brett's mother read something. A friend of theirs played guitar during the recessional. All of it was exactly right. At the reception, I found my table. I was seated with my aunt and uncle, a cousin I hadn't seen in years who lived in Oregon now, and two of Colt and Addie's friends from college. It was a good table. People were easy to talk to. I had 2 glasses of wine and genuinely enjoyed myself for the first time since I'd arrived in Nashville. Brett's father found me during the cocktail hour. I didn't know who he was at first. He was maybe 60, white-haired, wearing a well-cut gray suit, with the particular bearing of someone who'd spent a long time in rooms where things mattered. He introduced himself as Jim, not James Jim, and said he was glad I'd made it to the weekend. "Colt talks about you a lot," he said. "Says you're doing incredible work." "He's generous," I said. "He mentioned what you're working on. The drug delivery research." He said it with the specific precision of someone who actually knew what that meant, at NIH. I looked at him. "How do you know about that?" "I'm on the board at Children's National. We funded one of the trials in your department last cycle." He named the project. It was one I'd contributed to significantly for the past 14 months. I opened my mouth and closed it. "I recognized your name on the seating card," he said. "Sloane Harmon, Dr. Harmon. My colleague mentioned you specifically when we reviewed the trial outcomes." Yes," I said. "That's my work." "It's important work," he said simply, like it was a fact, not a compliment. We talked for another 20 minutes. He asked smart questions. I gave him real answers. At some point, my father walked past with a drink in his hand, and he nodded to Jim with the familiarity of 2 men who'd been introduced earlier in the day. Jim nodded back. My father's gaze moved to me, and something shifted in his expression. So briefly, I might have imagined it before he continued past. It was after dinner, during the dancing portion of the evening that I mostly watched from a table in the corner, that Brett's mother found me. She was warm the way some people are warm. Not performatively, not because they've decided you deserve warmth, but just as a condition of being. She sat down across from me with a piece of wedding cake and slid a second plate toward me without asking. "Eat the cake," she said. I ate the cake. It was good. Lemon with a lavender frosting that could have been overwhelming and wasn't. "Jim told me he talked to you," she said. "He did." "He called Brett on his way from the rehearsal dinner after." She paused. "He said Brett had told him a little about what happened, and then he looked you up and called Brett back to tell him." I set down my fork. "Your research is extraordinary," she said. "I don't say that to flatter you. I say that because Jim doesn't call people and say, 'Did you know?' unless he actually means it." I'm part of a team," I said. "I know. He knows that. He said you were the one who, his words, figured out the thing everyone else had been working around for 3 years. I didn't say anything to that." She looked at me for a moment. "How long has your family not known? Not known what? What you do, what you've actually been doing?" I thought about it. They know I work in research. My father thinks research is what you do when you couldn't get into a real career. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mother thought the same thing about Brett going into physical therapy instead of medicine. She didn't speak to him for almost 2 years. She said it without drama, as a thing that had happened and been survived. She came around. Did she apologize?" "Eventually." She smiled slightly. "It took longer than any of us wanted. The last thing that happened was at the end of the night. The guests were thinning out. Colt and Addie had done their send-off, running through a tunnel of sparklers to a car that had been decorated by their friends with the usual streamers and a just married sign. The catering staff was collecting glasses. My cousin from Oregon had already said goodnight. I was getting my wrap from the coat check when my father appeared. He didn't say anything at first. He stood next to me while I waited for the attendant to bring my things, and the silence between us was the particular silence of 2 people who have so much to say that none of it fits through the door in the right order. "Jim Calloway," he said finally. "Yes, You know him through your work. His board funds some of the research in my department." My father nodded. He had the look of a man who was holding two things simultaneously and finding them difficult to reconcile. "He spoke very highly of you," my father said. I didn't answer. "He said you'd been—" He stopped, started again. "He said the work your team produced had changed the standard of care for a certain category of pediatric patients." "It's early," I said. "The data looks good, but these things take time." My father looked at me, really looked at me in a way he hadn't in years, maybe longer. I'd forgotten that he could do that, look at a person like he was genuinely trying to understand something, not just weigh it. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. I knew what he was asking, not just about the research, about all of it, the fellowship, the publications, the grants, the years of work that I'd done quietly in a city far enough away that it didn't require me to explain myself to anyone who might find it insufficient. "Because I didn't know if it would be enough," I said. He frowned. "Enough for you. I didn't know if any of it would be. I didn't know what enough looked like, Dad, so I stopped trying to find out." The coat check attendant returned with my wrap. I thanked her. I took a small breath. "I came this weekend because Colt asked me," I said. "Not because I expected things to be different. I don't need them to be different tonight." "Sloane, I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because I've been waiting a long time to feel like my choices weren't a verdict, and I'm tired of waiting for that, so I've just been living my life." He was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere behind us, a glass clinked against another glass and someone laughed at something. "I was wrong," he Thursday night, what I said. I looked at him. "I was wrong," he said again, and his voice had the particular quality of a man who doesn't say that often and means it fully when he does. "I know," I said. "I'm not certain I understood. I didn't know." He stopped, tried again. "I made assumptions about what you'd been doing, about whether you were." He looked down. "I didn't know what you were building, and here was the thing. Here was the thing I had understood, somewhere on that 6-hour drive through West Virginia, somewhere between the bad coffee and the radio stations that kept cutting out. It shouldn't matter what I was building. That was the heart of it. Jim Calloway knowing my name shouldn't be the thing that changed the equation. My father shouldn't have needed an outside referral to look at his own daughter. I could have said that. Part of me wanted to. But I also looked at him standing there in his charcoal suit with the particular posture of a man in the process of understanding something he'd gotten wrong, and I thought about my mother squeezing my hand at the bread basket, and Colt laughing a little in the parking lot, and Brett just standing there that night at the restaurant, setting his sparkling water down and being present. I thought about Brett's mother and the lemon cake and the way she'd said she came around. Not triumphantly, not sadly, just as a fact of time. "I know you didn't," I said, and I meant it simply, without bitterness, because the truth is that none of us know what the people we love are building until we're standing close enough to see it, and sometimes we don't stand close enough. And sometimes that's our fault, and sometimes it's theirs, and usually it's some accumulation of both over years that nobody deliberately chose. "I'd like to," he said, "if you'd let me." I thought about the drive back to Pittsburgh, the gas station in West Virginia, the cup of coffee, all that ordinary distance. "That would take time," I said. "I know. I'm not ready to pretend Thursday didn't happen. I'm not asking you to." I nodded. He nodded. Around us, the staff was folding tablecloths. The chandelier above the empty dance floor threw light across the floor in pieces. "My next trial readout is in August," I said. "If the data holds, it'll be significant." He looked up. "If you wanted to understand the work," I said, "I could explain it. Sometime." "Not tonight, yes," he said, immediately. The way he used to say yes when I was 8 years old and asked if he wanted to see something I'd made, before all the years that came after it. I would like that very much. I found Colt near the exit to say goodbye, and he hugged me the way brothers do when they're relieved. Too long. A little awkward, entirely sincere. I told him the wedding was beautiful. He said he'd call next week. I told him he'd better. I drove back to the hotel. I changed into pajamas. I sat on the bed and I called Petra, and she picked up on the second ring, and I said, "Okay, so a lot happened," and she said, "I have wine, tell me everything," and I did. I drove back to Pittsburgh on Sunday morning. The weather was clear all the way through West Virginia. I stopped at the same gas station and the coffee was still bad and I bought it anyway. Some things take time. I know that. I'm learning to let that be enough.